I was looking at this and I said, what is the Tiny NES? Who is the Tiny NES? Why is the Tiny NES? The Tiny NES is an original Nintendo Entertainment System, or at least its original chips, repackaged into a smaller form factor with some modern electronics. This lets it run more reliably and a little more efficiently while still being completely compatible with original NES games. This isn't emulation or clone console, this is the real deal, original NES hardware, or at least the important bits from the original NES. It should run pretty much every single NES game in the exact same way they ran on fully original hardware. No shortcuts, it's an original NES, but smaller. This was a crowdfunded project, and you can still order them, but the quantities are currently very limited. They offer it with original hardware that's been pulled from real consoles, or can get it with clone chips for a few bucks cheaper, which might play a limited number of games with some slight inaccuracies you will never notice or care about. But that's technically not original, so it's a lot of money to spend on clone hardware because these things aren't cheap. They go for $210 plus shipping for clone chips, $230 with genuine chips. So why do I have this brand new, old, unopened console on my workbench other than for the obvious unboxing video? Well, at one stage of development, they decided to upgrade the compatibility of the Tiny NES so it would work with different versions of the hardware. The issue is that in order to make it work with a special RGB version of the chip, they left some pins floating, which made sense for compatibility, and it's a great feature add for people who own a rare NES-powered arcade cabinet and are thinking, yeah, let's break that. But it taught the designer of the console an important lesson in electronics engineering, which is to never ever leave pins floating, ever. So those floating pins cause some minor graphical glitches, and in order to fix it, they sent out a little jumper board for free, which needs to be installed to pull those pins down. And since I was going to rip this thing apart either way, now's a good time to show you how to install the jumper board in a Tiny NES. Do you remember how the N64 had a little jumper pack in it you could pull out in order to install more RAM? This is the exact same thing. Sparkio said, ironically, to an empty workbench, which is a metaphor for his life. Anyways, if you're part of the micro niche of people who's a big enough geek to own these consoles, but not enough of a nerd to want to rip one apart without a tutorial, I have a chapter marker for you, hypothetical person, and thanks for stopping by. I hope to see you again soon. For everyone else, there's Master Unboxing. So the Tiny NES is by a company called Tall Dog, which as far as I can tell is mostly just one person, Daniel Gilbert, aka Loglo, or maybe it's Loglo. I've only ever seen it written. The Tiny NES is completely open source, so if you wanted to make your own without buying it, you technically could, or you can make derivatives of it if you see something you want to improve. We've got Tiny NES Genuine, which is the real chips, so let's get this thing open and I'll show you what you get. Looks like we've got the instruction manual, which is one big fold out. For only one big sheet, this is pretty great. One interesting thing is they explain the audio output, which splits the 3 internal audio channels into 3 separate outputs. I don't know what I would personally do with that. I'm not exactly musically inclined. Maybe making chiptunes or something? I tried to drop a beat, but I picked up a radish. My flow is obsolete and my lyrics are baddish. Anyways, if you look down here, this is compatible with different CPUs and PPUs. And the PPU, the picture processing unit, is basically the graphics chip for the NES. There's a list of compatible chips, including third-party and RGB variants. The RGB compatibility is why we need to install this jumper board. I think the only way to get one of those chips is to rip apart a relatively rare arcade machine, so good luck finding one of those chips. And that's RGB video output, by the way, not fancy gaming lights. So even if you have that output, good luck finding a TV that supports it, because that's not exactly common in the United States. I mean, it's kind of neat to have that support, but maybe not worth it. The possible accessories are the RGB video kit, which would be installed in the same place as the new jumper board, the cartridge latch, which holds games more securely, which I don't have, but it was sent to certain backers, and the Famicom adapter, which I also don't have, but I might get later. Now, on the back of the instructions, which is much appreciated by the way, they include a schematic of the actual hardware. I wish everybody would do this. It's a work of art. I just want to put it on my wall. They also include a bill of materials, which will be very helpful when something goes wrong and they need to do a repair. And in the corner is the design they used on the box and the top of the console. This manual is great. I'm definitely going to keep this. Inside the box, you have a TRRS to RCA adapter. This is not for video. It's for splitting out the 3 internal audio channels, like I mentioned a minute ago. We also have a red RCA cable for normal mono audio. I like that it's braided, it makes it feel fancy. We also have a braided yellow RCA cable for composite video, a braided USB-C cable for power, it doesn't look like a very long one, maybe 3 feet, and finally a 20-watt USB-C power adapter. Underneath it all, we have the Tiny NES. They're really going all out on these holographic stickers, I guess. The entire case is made of circuit card material, which I think is a good choice because it feels super premium. And the body is very stiff, no noticeable flex. There's a really nice texture to the top of it, and the Tiny NES is printed with a sort of gold plating, like you would do with the contacts on a circuit card. There's some fancy gold detailing on the side. I don't know, maybe it helps with EMI. On the bottom, we have Tiny NES TD-TNES-T, March 24th, 2022. Some of these screws have arrows pointing at them, and some of them do not. On the back, you have outputs for TRRS, the power switch, which is small and not what I prefer, the main audio and video, and the reset button, which unfortunately is harder to push than I would like. It's probably a design compromise to keep things small, but I don't like that the power and reset buttons are this small and on the back. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm playing NES, I'm swapping games and smashing reset a lot more than I should probably admit, so I wish these were a bit more convenient. On the front, we have 2 controller ports, but this does not come with a controller, unfortunately. Some of the verbiage on the TinyNES website implied it might come with an 8-bit do wireless controller, which would have softened the blow of the kind of high price for this thing, but that must have been some kind of backer reward. So if you're ordering a non-backer one like mine, you should not expect it to come with a controller, so hopefully you already have one. Beneath the console, we get a sticker, a business card, and a little hex wrench which should open up the body wrapped up in an unnecessarily thick plastic bag. This is an unnecessarily thick plastic bag. Is that a sticker? Yes, it is! I live in Colorado, so I'm required to do this! How tiny is the TinyNES? I'm glad you asked. Well, it's roughly slightly bigger than an NES cartridge on its own, and about as thick as 2 NES cartridges. One little quirk is that when you do put in an NES cartridge, it does look a little bit misproportioned. Some games fit in very securely. This game, not so much. Now, if you want to get an NES clone console which won't have original chips, there are other options, like this Hyperkin Retron 1 HD, which is somewhat similarly sized but bigger. Feels much cheaper and plasticky, but it does have real power buttons. Much more importantly, it has an HDMI output. Right now, modern TVs and even name brand capture cards, I'm looking at you Elgato and IO Data, are not compatible with 240p input from an NES. They think it's 240i, so they attempt to de-interlace a non-interlaced image, and you get these jagged artifacts where every other line is offset by a pixel. It looks bad, and it makes text hard to read. You could use an older TV. I even have cheap old LCD TVs that work just fine. But if you want to capture footage of real cartridges, which I do, the most realistic way to get a good image is to bite the bullet and use a clone console with HDMI. The Retron also has a dust cover for its contacts, no dust cover on the TinyNES. But I digress. So I've tried out the TinyNES, and I do notice some waviness to the picture, especially on a solid blue background, which I have no chance to record by pointing a camera at an old plasma screen TV, and we just talked about my issues with capture cards. I also noticed that in Punch-Out, at certain points, if I unplug the video cable, the entire game would freeze, which shouldn't happen. I don't know if that's related to the jumper board or not. Maybe it's something like the game cartridge got wiggled and lost connection. Alright, now it's time to open up the TinyNES, take a peek inside, and install that jumper board. There are 8 screws on top, long, slow screws. Now that we have the top off, here's how to install that jumper board. It came in an envelope with a piece of foam, masking tape, and they even use real stamps with a cute bunny. They've also included another hex wrench. There's no sticker this time. Don't forget that hidden in the foam, there's also a plastic spacer. The jumper is a small black board with 3 sets of pins, part number TD-TDMY-A, dated January 2nd, 2023. So all you need to do is line up the jumper with these 3 sets of female headers on the main board and gently push it in until it's secure. That's it. The board can only go in one direction, and the spacer goes on top with the lid holding everything in place. That was easy. Almost too easy? So let's dive deeper and take a look at the rest of the system. This is revision Y of the main board. Right here we have the CPU RP2A03G and RP2C02G-0 for the PPU, which is not RGB compatible. These chips would have had to have been harvested from an original NES, but they're both perfectly clean and socketed. On the back of the lid, we have the model number again and a little mushroom guy. Right here is the power LED, which is going to light up and shine through the center of that pattern on the lid. We have the 3 female headers here. That's where the jumper board is installed. Before that, let's keep having a look around. Here we have 2 SRAM chips for the CPU and PPU, both surface mount. These are both 32 kilobytes of SRAM, not 2 kilobytes like a real NES. Normal NES games can't use the extra space. These chips are just cheaper right now, but maybe some homebrew will someday. Probably not. 2 switches, which are used to configure the board to different CPUs and PPUs. There are 2 more chips from Texas Instruments, U15 and U13, and we can conveniently check the bill of materials to see what those are. U13 is an IC octal latch. It's connected between the cartridge and the PPU, and U15 IC is a decoder/demux with a line going to the audio out. One curiosity is that one of Tall Dog's posts and on the Crowd Supply page, they mentioned a Texas Instrument chip that would be driving the composite video for a cleaner output, but I'm not finding that chip anywhere. I wonder why they went back to the single transistor design. Okay, so I sent a message to Mr. Gilbert, and he got back to me. Apparently it was too hard to get the TI chip at the time, and it didn't make enough of a difference to be worth it. The CPU and PPU are socketed, which is great news if you're like me and you happen to have some of the third-party clone chips laying around for no reason that you want to pop in and try out. The reason I have these actually is because I have all the parts I need to build a modern NES for myself instead of just buying everything in a nicely assembled package like the TinyNES. So get hyped for that in some future videos! The 2 controllers are connected by cables up here in the corner. Let's pull those out of the way. One feature of this board is that when you press the reset button, it goes through this little supervisor chip right here, U19. You probably can't see it. They say the chip makes it so you don't have to hold down the reset button when saving to certain games, for example, The Legend of Zelda and The Legend of Iowa. I'll have to test that out later, but hopefully it works because the reset button isn't ideal. The cartridge holder is 3D printed, but it's nicely done. I can barely see the layers, and that means quality. Let's try to pull this board out and take a look at the backside to see if there's anything fun. It looks like you need to remove the controller ports to slide the main board out. I don't love that. Under the main board, we have a diagram showing how to lay out the controller ports. They've labeled the size of the standoffs, and there's a pointer toward the rear in case that's not obvious. On the bottom of the board, there's a potentiometer to control the external audio for the Famicom, which I don't care about. There's a hole in the case that lets you access that. And that's mostly it. Let's start putting this thing back together. I had to just start screwing in these controller ports until they position themselves because they did not want to go back in there. That was annoying to put back together. I don't recommend pulling this board out unless you have a good reason. Let's finish putting everything back together and test to see if the jumper board's fixed anything. So yes, the graphical weirdness and waviness is better, but since I couldn't get the issue to show up on camera in the first place, I can't show you that it's fixed either. So sorry. Anyways, that's all I have right now. If you'd like more on the TinyNES, perhaps trying out some of these great new games in my collection, please let me know with a comment. Love it or hate it, the thumbs are still a thing. Please consider sharing the video if you know a place where you can do that. I've been Sparkio, and I'll see you next time.